Hey guys, tonight we're floating back a few thousand years, before coffee, before HR departments, and long before anyone thought maybe making someone collect other people's sweat for a living isn't great. So yeah, dim the lights, find a blanket, let your mind drift to a world where your daily commute might involve walking barefoot through camel dung just to earn half a loaf of bread and some questionable beer. We're talking about work in the ancient world, but not the glamorous kind. No poets, generals, or priests here. We're meeting the weird ones, the forgotten ones, the people who made civilization function in ways you probably wish they hadn't. Let's start in ancient Egypt, where the job market was surprisingly creative. You might think the pyramids were built by slaves. Hollywood sure does. But actually, they were mostly built by workers. Paid ones, kind of. Their payment was usually beer, bread, and onions, which feels like the ancient version of exposure, pay. And while everyone remembers the builders, no one remembers the pyramid cleaners. Yeah, someone had to keep those massive limestone blocks shiny for the pharaoh's eternal Instagram aesthetic. Workers would use vinegar, sand, and their own sweat to polish the stone until it gleamed in the sun. Imagine spending your life cleaning a dead guy's tomb that you'll never get to see inside. Now, among the more prestigious Egyptian jobs was the professional mourner. Their job, show up at funerals, cry dramatically, and convince everyone the deceased was super important. They wore special mourning dresses, covered themselves in dust, and screamed on cue. Think of them as ancient Oscar winners for best performance in a graveyard. And yes, it was mostly women, because apparently men couldn't be trusted to cry convincingly. Some of them were even hired in pairs to represent the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, so they came as a set, like the world's saddest wedding package. Let's glide gently over to Mesopotamia, where job titles got even stranger. The Sumerians, bless them, invented writing, which means they also invented paperwork. And thus, the first bureaucrats appeared, the tablet counters. These were people whose sole job was to count goats, beer jugs, or grain bags, and then carve that information into clay, all day, every day, just numbers, on clay. Forever. Imagine spending your life hunched over a tablet, carefully marking that yes, Uruk's grain reserves are still at 12 baskets, and no, you can't go home yet because the chief scribe says there's been a goat discrepancy. One archaeologist even found an ancient complaint tablet, basically the first customer review. A copper merchant wrote it to say, "Your copper was bad, and you lied about the weight." So yes, customer service nightmares are at least 4,000 years old. Now, Mesopotamia also gave us the temple washer. It sounds innocent, right? Like someone wiping down altars. No. This was a sacred janitor job that involved cleaning the statues of gods every single day, bathing them, dressing them, even feeding them offerings. The priests genuinely believed the statues could feel. So if you missed a spot or forgot to brush the god's bronze beard properly, you were basically committing divine neglect. Imagine the stress. Oh no, I forgot to polish Marduk's left eyebrow. Guess that's another plague on my family. Meanwhile, over in ancient Rome, job creativity took on a whole new level of, why does this exist? For starters, there was the fuller. Fullers were basically Roman dry cleaners, but their secret ingredient was urine. They'd collect it from public urinals, yes, that was a thing. Mix it with water and stomp on the clothes in vats of it to remove stains. You think your job stinks? Imagine explaining that your boss literally measures productivity by how yellow the floors are. Even better, the Emperor Vespasian decided to tax urine collection. When people complained it was disgusting, he shrugged and said, pecunia non olet. Money doesn't stink. He was right, but still. Maybe invest in sandals, and because Rome loved excess, they had nomenclators, basically professional memory assistants. Rich politicians would hire someone to whisper names into their ear during parties, so they wouldn't forget who anyone was. Yes, greetings, Marcus. Pause. Lucius? Yes, Lucius. How are the villas? All thanks to the poor guy standing behind him, whispering like the world's first Bluetooth earpiece. It's kind of sweet. Actually, human connection, sponsored by awkward whispering. Let's drift north for a moment to ancient Greece, where philosophers were inventing logic while regular people were just trying to get through the day. Enter the honey collector. Sounds lovely, right? Nope. Greek honey-gatherers often climbed dangerous cliffs to reach wild hives, dangling from ropes made of woven reeds while bees swarmed their faces. It paid well, but also it didn't, because Greece didn't really do workers' rights. You risked your life for something aristocrats would drizzle on cheese at dinner and call ambrosia. Then there were the healers of heroes, basically battlefield medics, except they worked with bronze tools, wine, and hope. Their medical textbooks included advice like, if limb falls off, sprinkle with vinegar. Weirdly enough, some patients survived, probably out of spite. Of course, not all ancient jobs were dangerous. Some were just weird. In China's Han Dynasty, there were court eunuchs, men who were castrated so they could safely serve in the palace without threatening the royal bloodline. They were supposed to be humble servants, but instead, many became terrifyingly powerful. Imagine losing everything down there and deciding, fine, I'll just control the emperor instead. And they often did. Entire dynasties rose and fell because of palace eunuchs manipulating politics behind the scenes. It's one of those unintended consequences of human history. You try to solve one problem, end up creating 10 worse ones. Now, in the same empire, there were also imperial taste testers. Their job was to sample the emperor's food first, in case it was poisoned. A truly high-stakes dinner. They were usually slaves or trusted servants. If the emperor made it through the meal alive, congratulations, you've survived another day. If not, well, you technically still did your job. Let's slowly drift back toward the sands of Egypt, because we can't skip one of the strangest careers of all, the crocodile feeder of Sobek. Sobek was the crocodile god, half man, half very bitey reptile. Priests kept sacred crocodiles in temple pools and treated them like divine pets, feeding them meat and adorning them with jewelry. When one died, it was mummified and buried with honors. Imagine the performance review. Strengths, punctuality, devotion to Sobek. Weaknesses, losing too many fingers. And of course, for every crocodile priest, there were hundreds of scribes, the ancient world's real MVPs of boredom. They copied everything by hand: laws, prayers, tax records, shopping lists. One Egyptian scribe even wrote a poem mocking manual laborers, saying things like, "The carpenter stinks of wood, the fisherman stinks of fish, but the scribe smells of ink." He forgot to mention that ink smells like fermented sadness after 10 hours in the desert. Let's stop here for a gentle pause. We've met the mourners, the fullers, the eunuchs, and the goat counters. But this was only the surface of ancient employment. In the next part, we'll drift into the deeper, darker corners of empire life, the entertainers, the testers, and the oddly specific people whose jobs made ancient luxury possible. So, stretch a little, take a sip of something warm, and when you're ready, we'll float into part 2, where we explore how the powerful kept their comfort, thanks to people whose entire careers were just bizarre. Alright, so by now we've seen who kept the temples tidy and who risked their necks feeding divine crocodiles. But tonight, we move a little closer to the palaces, the perfumed world of people who existed purely to make powerful folks feel even more powerful. Because if you were rich, royal, or just really into showing off, your staff list read like a fevered dream. Let's start with ancient Persia, under the Achaemenid Empire, home of emperors who thought luxury meant never seeing dirt again in your entire life. The Persian court was famous for its sheer number of attendants. You had cupbearers, robe-bearers, foot-washers, fan-holders, horse centers. Yes, someone literally sniffed horses to make sure they didn't smell too bad for royal parades. And of course, the keeper of the royal beard. The beard was serious business. A king's beard symbolized manliness, divinity, and general, don't mess with me, energy. So it needed constant maintenance. The keeper's job was to oil it, braid it, and occasionally perfume it with rose essence. Imagine spending your career staring at this same chin, praying your hands don't shake while you oil the empire's masculinity. The Persians also had royal parasites, and no, that's not just a metaphor. These were courtiers whose actual title was parasitos, from the Greek. Originally, it meant someone who ate at another's table, providing flattery and entertainment in exchange for food. They were professional, yes, men with excellent table manners. Your job was to laugh at all the king's jokes, nod wisely, and never, ever, have an opinion. You might think that sounds easy. But if you failed to amuse your host, you could lose more than your dinner invitation. It's the ancient version of performing emotional labor. Except, instead of quitting, you'd be executed for boredom. From Persia, let's float gently west toward ancient Greece again. Because if there was one thing the Greeks adored, it was hiring people for extremely specific nonsense. Take the Lampidarios. These were the official torchbearers of festivals and banquets. Their job, hold a flame without dropping it or burning down the symposium. Simple, right? Except Greek drinking parties went on all night. So imagine standing there, completely sober, holding a flaming stick while philosophers debated whether fish can think. There was even a game called Lampedodromia, torch races, where runners had to keep a flame lit while sprinting. It was considered sacred, so if you dropped your torch, you didn't just lose, you disappointed the gods. And then there were the public slaves of Athens. Sounds bad. And yeah, it was. But these weren't ordinary slaves. They worked for the state. Some were scribes, some were city guards, and one particularly famous group were the Scythian archers. Basically a police force made up of enslaved foreigners. Their job was to keep rowdy citizens in line. Imagine an entire police squad that isn't even allowed to live like citizens. Ancient democracy was complicated. They wore bright red clothes and carried ropes dipped in dye, which they'd use to mark people who refused to attend the assembly. Basically public attendance enforcement via body paint. Now, let's drift to ancient Rome again, because if anyone turned strange jobs into an art form, it was the Romans. Take the taster of bread warmth. Yes, this was a real position in some noble households. The taster would press a hand to freshly baked bread to ensure it wasn't too hot for their master's delicate fingers. It's what happens when you have too many servants and not enough dignity to go around. Then there was the nomenclator, who we met earlier. But we can't forget his friend, the praegustator, the food taster for poison. That job got surprisingly competitive. Some emperors rotated tasters daily so no one could be bribed. Others used slaves they trusted, right up until the poison worked too well. The most unlucky ones worked for Nero, who liked to test poisons recreationally. Imagine clocking and knowing your boss considers death just another flavor note. But my personal favorite might be the Imperial Feather Whisperer. Okay, technically they were called flabelliferi, attendants who waved enormous fans of peacock feathers to keep emperors cool during ceremonies. You'd think that would be relaxing, right? Wrong. The rhythm had to be perfect. Too slow and the emperor sweated. Too fast and the feathers stirred his precious toga. Do it wrong twice and you were replaced. A historian once joked that being a flabellifer was the closest thing Rome had to performance anxiety. Now, let's glide across the desert to Babylon, where the priests of Marduk employed a curious class of workers known as dream interpreters. People would come with their strange night visions. Flying goats, talking rivers, that one dream where you're late for a chariot exam, and the interpreters would consult clay tablets of symbolic meaning. For example, if you dream of eating figs, it means success. If you dream of figs falling from a tree, it means betrayal. Basically, ancient astrology meets bad Yelp advice. But they took it seriously. King Nebuchadnezzar reportedly employed entire teams of these interpreters to decide policy, because nothing says stable governance like, "We declared war because I dreamed of a snake." From the dreamers of Babylon, let's float to ancient China again, where court life reached new levels of organized weirdness. You had royal pillow testers, people whose job was literally to nap before the emperor did, to make sure the pillow stuffing wasn't lumpy or cursed. Yes, cursed. There was a real fear that enemies might enchant everyday items. So, unlucky testers were asked to try things first: beds, cups, robes. There were even imperial bed warmers, usually young servants who'd lie in the emperor's bed to make it cozy before he arrived. They were removed moments before he entered. It's one of those historical jobs that sounds glamorous until you realize it's mostly just being sweaty and terrified. Meanwhile, in India, the Mauryan Empire had one of the most bureaucratic governments in the ancient world, and thus, some truly niche civil service jobs. They had officers for counting fruit trees, officers for regulating prostitutes, even officers for supervising gambling houses. But the weirdest might be the inspector of liquids. His job, to ensure no one diluted wine or sold fake honey. Basically the world's first quality control manager. You can imagine the line at his door. "Sir, this date wine tastes suspiciously like sadness. And speaking of sadness, we can't skip the Roman vomiter attendant. No, not the stadium exit tunnels. Actual attendants whose job was to clean up after their masters during feasts. Romans loved their banquets, and yes, sometimes they'd induce vomiting to keep eating. Someone had to manage that. It wasn't considered shameful. It was hygienic luxury. Like having a towel warmer. Now, if we head over to ancient Egypt one last time, we'll meet the linen keeper of the gods. These were temple workers responsible for making and maintaining the fine linen wrappings for mummies and statues. Every thread had to be perfect. If one weave went wrong, the linen couldn't be used. It was considered ritually unclean. So these workers spent their lives spinning and folding, knowing their handiwork would be sealed in tombs forever. Imagine being a perfectionist in a job where your only audience is the dead. Let's take a quiet breath here. The lamps are burning low. The ancient world hums around us. Sandals on stone floors, the scrape of styluses on clay, a faint buzz of bees from some cliffside in Greece. So many lives spent doing tiny, strange things, feeding crocodiles, holding fans, sniffing horses, whispering names, each one part of the machinery of civilization, none remembered by name. In our next part, we'll wander into the world of entertainers and public oddities. The jesters, the human ornaments, and the poor souls whose job was simply to amuse the powerful. Because if you thought being a royal fan holder was bad, just wait until you meet the professional fool of Babylon. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived the bureaucracy, the beard oil, and the crocodile priests. Let's drift quietly into the candlelit rooms, where laughter was mandatory, music never stopped, and a few unlucky people discovered that being entertaining could be a life sentence. Every ancient empire had its share of performers, but these weren't the glamorous, red carpet types. They were the people who had to make kings smile on command. Picture it, a grand palace, marble floors, trays of figs and wine, and one exhausted dancer realizing she's been spinning for 6 straight hours because no one told her she could stop yet. In ancient Mesopotamia, music was everything. Every temple, every court, every festival needed sound. The best musicians were the temple harpists, women trained from childhood to play soothing hymns for the gods. They weren't allowed to marry. Their songs were considered offerings, their lives property of the temple. They played by torchlight in rooms heavy with incense, trying to please a statue that never clapped. And when they weren't playing for gods, they performed for priests who pretended not to notice when their fingers bled. In Babylon, entertainers could also be less musical. You had professional jesters, people employed to distract kings from the crushing weight of running an empire. Some were dwarfs or people with physical deformities, kept for novelty. Others were just quick with sarcasm, as long as it didn't cross the line into treason. That line moved daily. If you joked that the king's beard was crooked on a Monday, you might get a laugh. By Tuesday it might be blasphemy, a risky gig, honestly. Rome, predictably, took entertainment and ran it into the ground. They had actors, jesters, mimics, and a particular kind of performer called the mime, mostly women, who acted in bawdy plays that the elite pretended to hate, but always attended. Acting was considered morally low, which is hilarious given that half the Senate spent their evenings watching people pretend to be drunk gods. The irony was thick, which, in Rome, was the only thing thicker than the wine. Then came the gladiators, technically entertainers, though I doubt many saw it that way. Some volunteered, chasing fame or freedom. Others didn't. It's strange to think of a stadium filled with people cheering, while one man's entire life depended on how he swung a sword. Not exactly the bedtime version of fun, but hey, Rome called it bread and circuses. They just left out the emotional trauma. Moving east again, ancient China had its own brand of endless entertainment. In the imperial court, no day was complete without music, juggling, or the infamous 100 entertainments. Acrobats, storytellers, magicians, and animal trainers performing for hours, while the emperor dined in silence. Imagine the pressure of performing a magic trick for the Son of Heaven. You'd better hope that Dove actually appears, or you're becoming the next act. The Han emperors were particularly fond of dwarfs and curiosities. People brought a court for their size or appearance. They weren't treated cruelly, not usually, but their lives were stage managed. Every meal, every movement, scheduled for maximum amusement. One imperial record lists a laughing official, literally someone whose entire job was to laugh on cue to encourage others to enjoy themselves. That's the kind of soul, deep exhaustion you can't fix with tea. In Egypt, music was sacred. Dancers and musicians were part of nearly every ritual, from temple ceremonies to funerals. There was even a class of musicians of Amun, women who played sistrums, little rattles, in processions. It sounds nice until you realize they might spend 12 hours a day shaking a bronze rattle in the desert heat, trying not to drop it because that would offend the god. The sound was supposed to please divine ears, but I imagine after a few years it just pleased no one. And then there were the professional storytellers, the ancient equivalent of YouTubers. Really, they traveled from city to city, trading gossip, myths, and news. Some worked in taverns, others in royal halls. In Mesopotamia, they'd recite the Epic of Gilgamesh, often over several nights. Their voices would rise and fall like the desert wind, the audience drifting somewhere between reverence and sleep. A perfect job for people who could talk for hours, or in our case, 2. But the darker side of ancient entertainment was always the people who couldn't leave. Palace jesters, concubine dancers, child acrobats, many were slaves born into performance. In the Persian Empire, there were child singers trained for years to perform lullabies to help the royal family sleep. That was their entire existence, singing others to sleep, never resting themselves. If that doesn't feel poetic and miserable at once, I don't know what does. Over in Greece, entertainment had its own odd corners. Banquets often featured flute girls, not musicians of prestige, but hired performers who played and poured wine, their presence more decoration than artistry. Meanwhile, philosophers debated whether music could make a person moral. Imagine that. Plato's out here writing about the harmony of the soul, while a 12-year-old lyre player in the corner just wants a break. Greece also gave us the symposium clown. Yes, an actual role. Someone whose job was to lighten the mood when debates got too philosophical. Probably useful when half the guests were drunk on watered wine and yelling about virtue. One writer describes a clown who imitated philosophers for laughs. Another describes a man trained to juggle knives while quoting Homer. If that's not commitment to the bit, I don't know what is. In the Roman world, the entertainment industry ballooned into absurdity. There were professional mourners who cried at funerals, but there were also professional laughers who followed rich men around to chuckle at their jokes. Think of them as human laugh tracks. You'd see senators strutting through the streets, a train of paid laughter echoing behind them like a weird, ancient sitcom. And then there were animal trainers. Because Rome never met a creature it didn't want to parade around in chains. Lions, elephants, bears, all part of the show. Trainers spent their lives teaching animals to bow, march, or attack on cue. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they were lunch. Occupational hazard. Even the emperors got bored eventually. Nero famously performed music publicly, forcing crowds to listen under threat of punishment if they left early. Imagine being stuck at a concert you can't leave because the singer might execute you for yawning. History never changes much, does it? Some jobs blurred the line between art and devotion. In India, temple dances, later known as devadasis, performed sacred dances to honor gods. Their movements were prayers, their lives tied to the temple. Many were skilled artists, poets, musicians, but over time, their role shifted, less spiritual, more servitude. What began as sacred performance became a lifetime of control disguised as holiness. The rhythm stayed, but the meaning slipped away. And yet, even in all that exhaustion and exploitation, there's something quietly beautiful about these people. The dancer spinning in lamplight, the musician plucking strings in a cool courtyard, while somewhere nearby, incense curls into the night. They made sound and movement where there might otherwise have been silence. They were history's background noise, the heartbeat under marble and gold. When we think of ancient history, we picture the kings, the battles, the monuments, but all of it would have felt painfully empty without the hum of music, the chatter of jesters, the rustle of silk as dancers moved. Every empire needed its dreamers, its clowns, its human ornaments. Because even gods on thrones get bored eventually. Let's float a little further, past the echoing halls and laughter. The night grows quieter now. Outside the palace, another class of workers waits, not musicians or jesters, but the unseen ones who handled the empire's dirtier details. The poison testers, the cleaners, the people who knew every secret and got none of the credit. We'll drift into their world next, where loyalty meant survival and silence was the highest paying skill. It's a place of whispers, shadows, and, well, the occasional ancient janitor with divine anxiety. You can close your eyes if you like. Nothing exciting is going to happen. Just the quiet shuffle of servants through endless corridors, the soft drip of oil lamps burning low, and the faint, familiar hum of people doing strange things for powerful masters. Would you like me to keep going with the next section, where we wander through the secret jobs, the spies, poisoners, and whispers of ancient courts? Hey guys, still here? Nice. That means the night's working exactly as planned. The air's slow heavy, and the last echoes of music from those ancient banquet halls have faded out. Let's just stay in that quiet for a moment. The sort of silence you only get after everyone important has gone to bed and the real work begins. Because for every king, queen, or self-proclaimed God King sleeping under silk, there were dozens of people who couldn't sleep at all. The watchers, the testers, the ones whose entire existence revolved around making sure the powerful kept breathing, or, depending on who was paying them, maybe didn't. Ancient courts were full of secrets, and someone had to manage them. So let's wander softly through the candlelit halls of those invisible jobs. The ones you'd never see in a history textbook, but without which every empire would have collapsed in about a week. In ancient Egypt, the palace had its own version of security. Not soldiers, but whisperers. They weren't called spies, exactly. Their job was to listen. Servants, scribes, perfume mixers, anyone who could hover unnoticed. They'd catch gossip about who was stealing from temple offerings, or which noble was plotting something ambitious, and quietly pass it to the vizier. Imagine being paid to pretend you're invisible, nodding along while nobles complain, knowing every word you hear might decide your future. And of course, someone had to keep the royal body safe. Enter the poison testers, a job that existed in nearly every empire. In Persia, there were entire kitchens devoted to anti-poison routines. Everything the king ate was prepared by cooks who swore loyalty on their lives. Then the food went to the tasters. They took the first bites, waited a few minutes, and if they were still alive, the dish went forward. Some tasters lasted years. Others, well, they became part of the palace compost. Rome perfected the system naturally. The praegustator was an honored slave, sometimes even given gifts or status if they survived long enough. But imagine the mental math every meal. Is this my lucky day or my final one? The worst part, if the emperor died of poison anyway, everyone in the kitchen died with him. It wasn't exactly a stable career path. In China's imperial palaces, poison was an art form. Concubines competed for favor, eunuchs for influence, and food was both comfort and weapon. The emperor's meals passed through layers of inspection. Tasters, alchemists, astrologers even. Some believed timing mattered. A dish eaten under the wrong star alignment might be fatal, which, honestly, seems like a convenient excuse when your boss keels over mid-dinner. But there were other kinds of testers too. Candle testers, for example. These were servants who had to light each candle in the palace at dusk to check that the wax wasn't tainted. Sometimes enemies used slow, burning toxins that released fumes. You'd stand there, watching a tiny flame and wondering if it was about to kill you, tranquil in a horrifying way. Then there were the bath attendants. Every ruler needed them, and none of them got thanks. In Rome, the balneator was responsible for filling and maintaining hot baths. If the emperor liked it too cold, you might lose your job. Too hot, and he might lose his temper permanently. One unlucky bather, Caligula's attendant, reportedly disappeared after an uncomfortable temperature incident. Imagine waking every day knowing your entire career hinges on another man's bathwater. That's the ancient version of corporate anxiety. Over in Greece, some jobs straddled the line between servant and spy. Wealthy households had slaves known as pedagogoi, older men assigned to watch over boys of noble birth, guiding them to school, ensuring they didn't get into trouble. But the unspoken duty, report back to the family, it wasn't exactly mentorship. It was surveillance disguised as morality. And since we're here, let's talk about the household cleaners, history's quietest heroes and least appreciated souls. In big Roman villas, these were often slaves known as villici or familia rustica. They scrubbed floors, swept courtyards, and kept statues spotless. Everything had to shine. Even the sewage system had attendants, the foricari who maintained public toilets. They'd wade into the drainage tunnels to clear blockages with their hands. You could call them sanitation workers. Rome called them disposable. Meanwhile, Egypt had servants of the perfume house. Their duty, prepare oils, incense, and scented wax for the royal chambers. Sounds nice, until you remember ancient perfume was made by crushing flowers, fat, and resin by hand for hours. The scent might have been divine, but the sweat behind it was very human. And then, of course, there were the people whose job was to disappear. Literally. The cleaners of corpses, the embalmers, the burial servants, those who dealt with death so the living didn't have to. The Egyptians called them hands of purity, which sounds poetic, but the irony is that no one wanted to touch them. They were ritually unclean, socially shunned, even though without them, every pharaoh would have decomposed before his pyramid was finished. In Rome, the equivalent were the polinctors, the undertakers. They prepared bodies, applied makeup, and placed coins on the eyes. They were needed but despised, living on the city's outskirts. If you think modern funeral homes are gloomy, imagine living in a time when even your shadow was bad luck. China had a different kind of invisible worker, the recorders. These were palace scribes who documented everything the emperor did, said or ordered. Every conversation, every gesture. Their scrolls were locked away and couldn't be read by anyone but later historians. It meant that every word spoken in the throne room had an echo. Someone somewhere was always writing it down. That kind of quiet power made them dangerous. More than one emperor tried to erase them from the record. Some succeeded. Others forgot that paper survives longer than pride. Back in Persia, the royal couriers were the empire's nervous system. They carried messages on horseback across thousands of miles, using a relay system that inspired later postal routes. The saying went, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night stops these couriers," which, yes, is where the modern postal motto comes from. What they left out was that most of those couriers died young. Broken bones, dehydration, bandits, all just part of the route. They were the messengers of empire, and no one remembered their names. Then there were the cleaners of temples, the people who removed animal sacrifices, scrubbed altars, and mopped up blood. Every religion had them, and none liked to talk about it. In Greece, the priest might sprinkle the wine and say the words, but it was the nameless attendants who had to pick up the goat parts afterward. It's one of those details that doesn't make it into marble reliefs. Some jobs were darker still. In Egypt, there were keepers of secrets. They served high priests and were bound by oath never to reveal temple rituals. Breaking that vow wasn't just dishonor. It meant torture, sometimes death, and yet they were prized because they knew everything. Where the treasures were kept, which priests faked miracles, which mummies weren't actually royal. In a way, they were the ancient version of data security. In Rome, you had informants called delators. Their entire job was to accuse people of crimes, usually political ones, in exchange for reward money. It became such a problem that emperors used them to purge rivals. A delator could make or destroy a senator with a single accusation. One historian called them wolves with pens. You can almost hear the quiet scratching of their wax tablets in the dark, each stroke another person's ruin. The longer you look at history, the clearer it becomes. Most people weren't building pyramids or philosophizing about truth. They were sweeping floors, tasting soup, and trying not to die for someone else's comfort. Civilization has always depended on the tired hands of people no one thanked. Let's rest in that thought for a second. The candles are nearly out. The palace halls are silent except for the slow rhythm of footsteps, servants making final rounds before dawn. Somewhere, a poison tester is exhaling with relief after another safe meal. A bath attendant adjusts the temperature one last time. A scribe dips his pen in ink, finishing a line no one will ever read. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them. The hum of ordinary survival beneath the marble noise of history. The unseen heartbeat that kept empires alive. We can drift further still, if you want, to the people outside the walls entirely. The street workers, the beggars, the midwives, and the fortune tellers who formed the real pulse of ancient cities. The ones history forgot not because they were unimportant, but because they were everywhere. Would you like me to keep going and take us out into their world next? All right, step outside with me. The palace doors close behind us, and suddenly the air changes. It smells of dust, sweat, and roasted grain from street vendors who never sleep. This is where the real life of the ancient world beats. Outside the marble gates, where power was only ever something you overheard. Picture a narrow Roman alley before sunrise. The cobblestones are slick with last night's rain, and somewhere down the lane, a man is already shouting about bread. That's the Sirs Pister the baker. He's been awake since midnight, kneading dough by torchlight. Roman ovens were massive, shared by neighborhoods, and bakers rented heat by the hour. They were the first to rise and the last to rest, and if the bread burned, well, no one ever blamed the fire. They blamed the man. A few streets over, the fullonis, the launderers, are already at work. Their secret ingredient, human urine, collected from pots left on corners, sold to wash clothes. The ammonia lifted stains, but the smell never left. Fullers spent their day's ankle, deep in that chemical soup, beating fabric with sticks, singing songs to drown the stench. You can almost admire the optimism it took to hum in a vat of other people's waste. As the light spreads, the markets wake up, and with them, the vendors of everything. Fishmongers calling prices, spice sellers waving smoke to chase flies, old women selling charms and love potions made of herbs and, sometimes, less pleasant ingredients. The noise isn't chaos, it's rhythm. Each sound means someone's surviving, and among them, the fortune tellers set up shop. In Greece, they were the esmantis, seers who read the flight of birds or the curl of smoke. In Rome, the haruspices read animal guts. Their clients weren't just peasants. Senators and generals paid handsomely for a good omen. Behind the superstition was a kind of business savvy. Tell a man his future depends on your ritual, and you'll never go hungry. But not all fortune tellers had temples or altars. Many were street women, old, sharp-eyed, carrying bones and shells in worn pouches. People came to them quietly, asking about love, sickness, missing family. They were half healers, half therapists, and for many, the only comfort life offered. By mid-morning, the Ez water carriers made their rounds. Cities without plumbing depended on them. They filled jars from public fountains, balanced them on wooden frames, and trudged house to house. The job broke backs and paid almost nothing, but it kept neighborhoods alive. In a way, they were the circulatory system of civilization, the veins that carried life to every corner. And where there's water, there are midwives, the forgotten professionals of every age. In ancient Greece, they were trained, respected, even feared. A good midwife could save lives, a bad one could doom generations. They knew herbs that stopped bleeding, salves that soothed fever, and prayers that calmed fear. But when something went wrong, it was always their fault. When it went right, the gods got credit. As day fades, the city changes character again. Shadows stretch long, and the street cleaners begin their quiet work. Men with brooms of reeds, sweeping garbage into piles, clearing markets for the next morning. In Rome, they were part of the cohort's vigilum, a mix of firefighters and night guards. If a cart overturned, they fixed it. If a thief ran by, they caught him. If a house burned, they doused it. No one admired them, but everyone needed them. Out in the countryside, far from the noise, the shepherds kept watch. For most of history, this was children's work. Lonely, silent, sometimes dangerous. You spent weeks in the hills, sleeping under stars, listening to wolves, counting the same sheep over and over. Poets later romanticized shepherds as symbols of peace. But the truth, they were poor, dirty, and bored out of their minds. Still, they knew the land better than kings did. Back in the city, night falls fully, and the Urge lamp-lighters make their rounds. With a pole and a small flame, they touch the wicks along the streets. One after another, like constellations coming alive, they weren't just lighting roads, they were keeping fear away. In every era, darkness belonged to thieves, spirits, and memories you didn't want to face. A single flame meant someone cared enough to push it back. And as the lamps burn, the S-night soil collectors come out. Their job was exactly what it sounds like, cleaning the cesspits, carrying waste beyond city walls. They moved through streets no one else would walk, invisible, essential. If they did their job right, no one noticed. If they failed, disease followed. Civilization balanced on their shovels. Every society has its invisible class, the ones who keep the rest upright. The palace had its poison testers and scribes. The city had its bakers, cleaners, and midwives. None of them wore crowns, yet their fingerprints are all over history. You just have to look closely enough to see the smudge marks. The hum of the city dies slowly. You can almost feel it. The warmth of fires, the scent of bread still lingering. The quiet satisfaction of people who worked hard enough to earn their sleep. Tomorrow, it'll start again, just as it has for thousands of years. Empires rise and fall, but the rhythm of ordinary life never changes. If you listen close, you can still hear them. Footsteps on stone, laughter in the dark, whispers over glowing coals. The heartbeat of history isn't in the palaces or battlefields. It's out here, in the streets. Want me to keep going? To the travelers next, the wanderers, traders, and explorers who carried stories, diseases, and ideas across the ancient world. Let's drift now, slowly, away from the city lights. The fires shrink behind us, until they're just little orange glows in the dark. Out here, the air is cooler, the road is rough, the stars are steady, and the sound of hooves and wheels becomes the new heartbeat of the world. This is the realm of travelers, merchants, messengers, soldiers, and wanderers, the kind of people who saw empires not as maps, but as long, endless stretches of dust. Picture a trader from Mesopotamia. He's been on the road for weeks, maybe months. His donkeys are loaded with jars of oil, bundles of textiles, and a few small trinkets meant to catch foreign eyes. Every night, he camps by some nameless stream, eats flatbread that tastes faintly of smoke, and listens to the sound of unseen creatures moving in the dark. He's not rich, but he's part of something huge. The slow pulse of trade that connected cities long before anyone thought to draw borders. The ancient merchant was part salesman, part diplomat, part gambler. He had to negotiate with bandits, bribe guards, flatter priests, and sometimes outrun tax collectors. One wrong turn on a caravan route, and you could vanish into the sand forever. But if you made it back with your cargo intact, the profit could change your life. The Phoenicians were masters of this. They sailed the Mediterranean like it was their personal pond, trading everything from purple dye to cedar wood. Their ships hugged the coastline, slipping into every port like polite thieves. They didn't conquer with swords. They conquered with contracts. In their wake, they left colonies, languages, and half the myths of the Western world. Of course, not every traveler was chasing wealth. Some were chasing knowledge. The Greek philosophers loved to wander, partly for wisdom, partly for dramatic effect. You couldn't just think deep thoughts in one city. You had to walk hundreds of miles to think them somewhere else. Herodotus, for example, the so-called father of history, basically turned gossip into an art form. He wandered through Egypt, Persia, and Greece, collecting every rumor that crossed his path. Half of what he wrote is true. The other half is entertaining. Then there were the messengers, the unsung heroes of every empire. In Persia, they had the Angarium, a royal postal system that put modern bureaucracy to shame. Riders switched horses at each station, covering hundreds of miles a day. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night. That old postal motto. Yeah, that started with them. They didn't have email, but they had endurance, and probably saw everything. Meanwhile, in China, the Silk Road couriers carried more than silk. They carried rumors, recipes, religions, and diseases. They were the internet before the internet, slow, dusty, and occasionally fatal. One week you're delivering spices. The next, you've accidentally introduced smallpox to an entire province. Oops, the Roman couriers had it no easier. The roads were good, better than Europe would see again for 1,000 years. But travel was still dangerous. Bandits loved couriers, so did corrupt governors. A message could get intercepted, altered, or simply lost if someone paid enough. So Rome made their messengers state property. Killing one was like slapping Caesar himself, and still they died by the dozens. The ancient world didn't have insurance. If a bridge collapsed or a lion decided you looked tasty, that was that. You became a footnote in someone else's letter. Let's wander further, toward the ports. Here the dock workers were the lifeblood of empire. They unloaded cargo, repaired sails, mended ropes, and probably swore more than anyone else in history. Dock life was chaos, shouting, bargaining, splashing, the stink of fish and sweat. But it was also a place of connection. You could meet a Nubian trader, a Greek sailor, and a Roman tax collector all within a few feet of each other. It was like the ancient version of an airport, minus the overpriced sandwiches. Ships didn't sail themselves, of course. The rowers, often slaves or criminals, powered galleys for hours on end. The rhythm of the oars was kept by a drummer or a flute player, which sounds poetic until you realize it was just to make sure everyone rowed in sync. Miss a beat, and you'd get the lash. It was teamwork, but with more pain. And yet, on some calm evening, with the sun sinking into the sea and the waves steady as breathing, you can imagine those men looking out at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond it, wondering if they'd ever see home again. History doesn't record their names, but every empire rode on their backs. Back on land, we meet the as innkeepers, the eternal witnesses of travel. Their taverns were equal parts shelter, gossip hub, and disease factory. Travelers came and went, leaving behind rumors, fleas, and the occasional corpse. A good innkeeper knew when to smile, when to listen, and when to quietly move a body out back before anyone noticed. In Greece, the inns were famously terrible. Straw floors, bad wine, and prices that changed based on how gullible you looked. Romans improved things slightly. They built mansions along their roads, official inns for couriers and officials, but even those were more government dorm than luxury stay. If you were lucky, the food wasn't alive. Those entertainers followed travelers like shadows, musicians, acrobats, storytellers, the portable joy of the ancient world. They performed in markets, at banquets, or anywhere someone had a coin and an audience. Some became famous, most didn't. But their songs and stories outlived them, floating from one campfire to the next. In a world with no TV, they were the binge content of their day. And then there were the as pilgrims, travelers of faith rather than fortune. They walked to temples, tombs, and sacred springs, often carrying offerings or seeking miracles. Some returned healed, others returned broke. Many didn't return at all. Still, they walked, because walking was the prayer itself. Travel, for the ancients, was never easy, but it was irresistible. Every road promised something, wealth, wisdom, or at least a story worth telling. And maybe that's why humanity kept moving, even when standing still would have been safer. So tonight, as we rest on this dusty road under stars older than history, maybe think about all those feet that walked before ours. The couriers, the traders, the wanderers who carried pieces of the world on their backs. They didn't know it, but they were building connections that would outlive them all. Let's keep drifting then. Next, we'll step into the quieter corners. The healers, the scribes, the astrologers, the people who worked not with their hands, but with secrets. Would you like me to continue there? All right, let's keep walking. The road softens again, fading into silence. The fires of camps and markets disappear behind us, and ahead, just candlelight in windows, soft chanting, maybe the faint scratch of a quill. We're entering the quieter end of the ancient workforce, the people who didn't haul, hammer, or sweat, but worked with things far stranger: words, stars, spirits, and the human body itself. Let's start with the scribes, history's original office workers. They were the backbone of every ancient bureaucracy, from Egypt's golden halls to Mesopotamia's dusty city-states. And yes, they were just as overworked and underappreciated as any modern clerk with a bad back and a cheap pen. The Egyptian scribe sat cross-legged all day, carving little symbols into papyrus, letters, taxes, grain tallies, love poems, or whatever the pharaoh's accountants demanded. They learned their craft in special schools where discipline was, let's say, intense. Students copied texts until their fingers cramped, then copied them again for good measure. Teachers encouraged focus with beatings, because nothing says academic excellence like mild trauma. But for all that, scribes had power, real power. In a world where only a tiny fraction of people could read, they were the bridge between thought and action. They knew the records, the laws, the debts. They could make a man disappear on paper long before he vanished in real life. In Mesopotamia, scribes used clay tablets instead of paper. Thousands of them survive. Letters, receipts, even petty complaints. My favorite might be one from 1750 BCE, where a merchant writes, "You have not sent the good copper. You have treated me badly." So basically, the world's oldest customer service rant. Some things never change. Now, just down the corridor from the scribes were the healers. Calling them doctors might be generous. Ancient medicine was equal parts trial error and wild optimism. Egyptians used honey, moldy bread, and crocodile dung for wounds. The Greeks preferred bleeding because apparently losing half your blood was considered a lifestyle choice. But not all of it was nonsense. Egyptian physicians knew how to reset bones, stitch wounds, and even perform simple surgeries. The Papyrus Ebers, a medical text from around 1550 BCE, lists hundreds of treatments, some weird, some genius. They didn't understand germs, but they knew cleanliness mattered. That's something. Greek medicine took things further, or at least louder. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, famously believed that all illness came from an imbalance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It's basically the world's least appetizing smoothie recipe. Treatments included vomiting, bathing, or drinking wine. The last one probably helped, at least emotionally. But the real stars, pun intended, were the astrologers. These were the cosmic bureaucrats of ancient life, reading the heavens like an annual report. In Babylon, every king had one. If Mars moved the wrong way, wars were postponed. If a comet appeared, someone probably got sacrificed, just to be safe. The logic was simple. The sky was perfect, humanity was messy, so maybe the stars knew better. And honestly, after a few centuries of bad rulers, you can't really blame people for looking upward for guidance. In Rome, astrology was fashionable, until it wasn't. Emperors loved it when the stars said nice things. When they didn't, astrologers tended to have short careers and shorter lifespans. But the practice never died. It just moved underground, whispered in villas and temples, waiting for another desperate noble to ask, "Am I doomed?" Meanwhile, the philosophers were out in the streets, asking equally impractical questions. Socrates wandered around Athens, annoying everyone with his "but why" habit. His students wrote down everything he said, turning casual chats into sacred texts. Plato built an academy. Aristotle wrote enough books to make a modern library look lazy. All of them obsessed over virtue, truth, and how to be good. Though none of them seemed especially good at not judging others. Across the Mediterranean, in Egypt, priests served as both scientists and mystics. They read omens, interpreted dreams, and handled the endless paperwork of the gods. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were administrative centers, schools, hospitals, and banks. Religion and bureaucracy walked hand in hand. The gods had ledgers, and priests made sure they balanced. Further east, in India, the Brahmins did much the same, chanting hymns, keeping rituals precise, maintaining cosmic order one syllable at a time. If the chant went wrong, the universe might wobble. No pressure. And yet, while priests managed the heavens, someone else had to manage the ground. Enter the of tax collectors. These were the most universally despised people in ancient life, and arguably the most necessary in Rome. They were the ves publicani, private contractors who collected taxes for the state, taking a generous cut for themselves. If your village couldn't pay, they'd take your animals, your tools, or occasionally your children. Bureaucratic efficiency. ancient style. In Egypt, tax collectors were even worse, because everything, even the Nile flood, was taxable. Priests, scribes, and soldiers could be exempt. Farmers, never. Somewhere in the papyrus archives, you can almost hear the sighs of exhausted peasants muttering about quotas while a smug official counts grain with a grin. Every empire, every kingdom, every city had its own quiet workers of control, scribes who recorded, priests who justified, astrologers who explained, and collectors who enforced. Together, they kept the illusion of order alive. But behind all that order were the little cracks, the mistakes, the bad translations, the forged receipts, the misplaced prophecies. Civilization has always been built on a thin layer of paperwork and hope. Somewhere, in a candlelit chamber, a tired scribe dips his reed pen again. A healer mutters over herbs. A priest stares at the stars, trying to decide what omen to invent for tomorrow. It's all so fragile, and yet it lasts, somehow. So let's move again, gently, away from the priests and scribes, into the shadows behind the walls. Let's meet the ones history barely noticed, the servants, the jesters, the slaves, the ones whose jobs were quiet, endless, and often heartbreaking. Would you like me to keep flowing there, into that world of invisible labor and whispered survival? All right, let's slip into the shadows now. The palaces and temples still hum faintly in the distance, voices echoing, torches flickering, sandals brushing over marble floors. But we're stepping behind all that, into the quiet corridors and back courtyards where the real heartbeat of ancient life kept time. Here are the servants, the invisible gears that kept every grand house and royal estate from collapsing under its own vanity. They woke before dawn, worked through the night, and were forgotten by sunrise. Every ruler had them, every noble needed them. Cooks, bath attendants, scribes, stable boys, torch bearers, hairdressers, and the unfortunate souls who had to empty the chamber pots of the great and powerful. In ancient Egypt, some servants were trusted enough to handle sacred duties, fanning the pharaoh during ceremonies, dressing him in the morning, or even tasting his food first. That last job wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. If something was poisoned, congratulations. You found out first, by dying. In Rome, servants reigned from near family to near furniture. Wealthy households could have hundreds, all ranked in a delicate social hierarchy. Some managed accounts and corresponded with other estates, the ancient version of middle management. Others handled the baths, the kitchens, or the never-ending task of keeping senators clean in a city that smelled like hot sewage half the year. And then there were the slaves, the foundation that every ancient empire stood on, whether they liked to admit it or not. They built roads, raised temples, and rowed ships. They cooked the feasts, taught the children, and died in wars that weren't theirs. Rome had millions of them. They came from conquered lands, Gaul, Greece, Egypt, Judea, their identities stripped away and replaced with one word: service. Some were treated decently, even educated. Others lived short, brutal lives in mines or quarries, barely surviving on rations that wouldn't feed a dog. Freedom existed, technically, but only as a rumor, a prize for loyalty or luck, or the amusement of a master feeling generous that day. And yet, even within that system, there were moments of strange humanity. Some masters fell in love with their slaves. Some freed them in their wills. Some slaves became wealthy, even powerful, buying their own freedom and opening shops or managing estates. History loves neat moral lines, but life rarely offers them. Among the strangest and saddest figures were the eunuchs, men castrated young, often enslaved, who became trusted servants in royal courts. It was a practical cruelty without families. They were seen as loyal only to the throne. in Byzantium, in China, in the Ottoman palaces centuries later. They guarded harems, managed treasuries, and whispered in the ears of kings. Power without freedom. Influence without identity. It's hard not to feel something heavy for them. They lived inside history's richest rooms, but never truly belonged to them. Then there were the jesters, the fools, the entertainers, the strange, fragile figures allowed to say what no one else could. Long before medieval courts, ancient rulers also kept them. In Egypt, dwarfs and performers were prized for their rarity and wit. In Greece, symposia, elite drinking parties, always included someone to provoke laughter between debates about virtue and death. A good jester knew the boundaries. He could mock the powerful only so far before funny became execution worthy. And yet, many thrived on that thin edge. They saw everything, heard everything, and lived by their wits. In some ways, they were the freest people in the room, the only ones allowed to tell the truth, disguised as a joke. And somewhere nearby, always listening, were the musicians, lyre players, harpists, flutists, sound weaving through marble halls and flickering lamps. In temples they played for gods, in courts for kings, in taverns for coins. Music crossed every line, slave and free, rich and poor. A good melody needed no translation. Of course, not all sound was art. The kitchens of the ancient world were a kind of organized chaos, where cooks ruled with iron spoons and louder voices. They managed supplies, slaughtered animals, and invented recipes that ranged from ingenious to deeply questionable. Roman chefs loved dishes like dormice stuffed with nuts and honey. Egyptian banquets served goose liver, figs, and beer thicker than porridge. Cooks had to balance flavor with danger. Food poisoning wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a royal scandal. So they learned tricks. Spices to hide the smell of old meat, herbs to mask the taste of bad wine. Culinary innovation was often just panic with seasoning. And in the baths, the bath attendants. Ancient bathing culture was practically a full-time industry. In Rome, public baths were daily rituals. Attendants kept the water hot, scraped oil from patrons' skin, and politely ignored whatever questionable activities were happening in the steam rooms. They were invisible, like ghosts. Always there, never acknowledged. Meanwhile, deep in temple vaults or palace libraries, a quieter kind of servant worked. The record keepers, the ones who stored and guarded knowledge. Clay tablets stacked high, scrolls wrapped in linen, papyri filled with ink that might outlast the empire itself. Imagine being one of them, alone by torchlight, rewriting a text for the 1,000th time, never knowing that centuries later people would dig it up and call it civilization. They didn't think they were preserving greatness. They were just doing their jobs. And outside those walls, in the night, other unseen workers moved. The gravediggers, the undertakers, the people who dealt with what everyone else preferred not to see. In Egypt, they were trained in ritual and precision. In Rome, they were outcasts, handling death, so others could pretend it didn't exist. Without them, the cities would have drowned in their own mortality. Every empire had its shining face, its temples, generals, poets, and kings. But behind that, always was this quiet machinery of hands and hearts. People who labored without reward, loved without permission, and left no statues behind. Their names are gone, but their work remains. The roads, the walls, the songs, the stories, all made by people no one bothered to remember. So as the night deepens and the last candles burn low, we might as well whisper a little thank you. To the servants who woke first and slept last, to the scribes who wrote everything down, to the fools who made the kings laugh, to the slaves who built the stones we still admire. History, after all, is just the shadow those lives left behind. Would you like me to keep going, to float onward into the final stretch about the as lost professions and the as vanished trades the ancient world forgot? All right, let's keep floating forward. The halls have gone quiet now. The torches have burned low, the marble floors are empty, and even the servants have drifted off to sleep somewhere on the cold edges of history. But beyond the cities, beyond the walls and markets, there are still people working, people whose trades are so strange, so specific, that time itself eventually forgot them. These are the as lost professions, the jobs that once seemed essential, even noble, but vanished like smoke when the world moved on. Let's start with something oddly poetic, the as professional mourners. Yes, that was a real job. In Egypt, Greece, Rome, even parts of China, wealthy families hired women, always women, to cry at funerals, loudly. The more dramatic, the better. They tore their hair, beat their chests, wailed until their voices cracked. It wasn't grief, it was theater. A good mourner could turn a mediocre burial into an event, some even specialized by class. There were mourners for soldiers, mourners for children, mourners for the especially corrupt, each with its own style of lament. You might laugh, but it made sense. In societies obsessed with honor and the afterlife, being properly mourned was almost as important as living well. No one wanted to die uncried for. A few steps away, in the same ancient streets, another odd figure worked, the professional letter writer. For most of history, reading and writing were luxuries. So when ordinary people needed to send a message, they found someone who could hold a pen. These scribes set up shop in marketplaces, by temples, or near city gates, writing love letters, petitions, even complaints to the authorities. Picture it, a man in a dusty robe dictating to a scribe, "Tell the governor that his tax collectors stole my goat again." And the scribe, sighing, carefully composing it in elegant script. It's bureaucratic poetry, really. The first customer service department, except with clay tablets. Then there were the perfume makers. In ancient Egypt, scent was serious business. Perfume wasn't just about smelling nice. It was religion, medicine, and seduction all at once. Some perfumes were so valuable they were sealed in tombs, meant to please the gods or tempt them, depending on the occasion. Myrrh, frankincense, lotus oil. Every drop was distilled from plants, resins, or sometimes animal fat, all mixed in small stone laboratories behind temples. The recipes were secret. Families guarded them for generations. And yes, some ingredients were strange, like civet musk, scraped from the glands of animals. Beauty has always demanded odd sacrifices. Moving on, there's a less glamorous trade, the leech collector. Medicine in the ancient and medieval worlds was obsessed with balance, especially blood. Too much of it, they said, caused fever, anger, or insanity. The cure, remove some, and that meant leeches. Collectors waded into marshes barefoot, letting the leeches attach to their legs. Then they peeled them off and stored them in clay jars for sale to physicians. It was messy, dangerous, and, if you think about it, pretty brave, or pretty foolish. Sometimes those tiny creatures carried infections, but hey, people will risk anything for steady pay. Another lost job was the taster. Though technically, this one lingered longer than it should have. In royal courts from Babylon to Byzantium, there was always someone whose job was to eat first and hope for the best. Every meal was a gamble. Some tasters lived long lives, others not so much. You can almost imagine the tension. The king sits down, eyes his cup of wine. The taster sips. Everyone waits. If he smiles, the party begins. If he doesn't, well, someone's about to lose more than their appetite. Then there were the torchbearers, real people whose job was simply to hold light. In a world before electricity, that was a full-time task. At night, banquets, ceremonies, and processions all needed steady hands and steady flames. Some were servants, some slaves, some apprentices. All had one mission: don't drop the fire. Which, considering the flammable robes and wooden buildings, seems like an enormous amount of pressure for such little pay. And yet, without them, the ancient night would have been completely dark. One of the strangest trades came from Greece, the parasite. No, not the biological kind. This was a social role. A man who lived by flattering the rich at dinner parties. He'd offer witty conversation, jokes, or gossip in exchange for food. It was an art form, part stand-up comedy, part survival tactic. The word parasite literally means one who eats beside civilization's first professional freeloader. Then we have the sandal makers, whose work literally held empires together. Roads were great, but without sandals, no one was walking far. Roman soldiers went through them constantly. A good sandal maker could patch leather in minutes, reshape soles, or weave cords to last through endless marches. No fame, no fortune, just sore hands and the knowledge that you were the unsung support of the empire. And somewhere nearby worked the air's lamplighters, the ones who brought night to life. Each evening, they'd walk the streets with torches and long poles, lighting the lamps one by one. In the morning, they'd come back to extinguish them. You can imagine the rhythm of their days, flame to flame, step to step, like quiet guardians of civilization's small glow. There were also rat catchers, though their work was less poetic. Ancient cities were filthy, and rats carried disease long before anyone knew what bacteria meant. These catchers used dogs, traps, or even snakes to keep infestations down. Sometimes they paraded through town with dead rats to prove their success. A grotesque but effective marketing campaign. And we can't forget the heralds, the public voices of the ancient world. Before printing, before town criers, there were men whose job was to shout official messages in marketplaces and streets. Royal decrees, tax announcements, punishments, and marriages, all declared by someone with a strong set of lungs and, hopefully, clear diction. They were the news before news existed. Every era had its strange blend of necessity and absurdity. Every job made sense to someone at the time. Perfume makers and mourners, leech collectors and torchbearers, each played a tiny, essential role in the slow machinery of civilization. And then, as centuries passed, they faded. Machines replaced them, customs changed, priorities shifted. What once was vital became quaint, then forgotten. But you can still feel their ghosts sometimes, in the smell of perfume, in the echo of a funeral hymn, in the way streetlights flicker to life at dusk. Those tiny human habits never really die. They just change uniforms. The night's getting quieter now. The fires are nearly out. The roads are empty again. And if you listen carefully, maybe you'll still hear them. The footsteps of those who worked, served, sang, or carried light through the endless dark. The ones who never had statues, but built the world anyway. Would you like me to keep going into the soft closing? A calm, reflective ending that ties the whole journey together, like the final few minutes before sleep. All right, let's drift toward the quiet end of the night. The air feels heavy now, not unpleasantly, just the way the world does when it's done talking. The fires are down to embers. The streets, the temples, the markets, they've all gone still, and what's left are the ghosts of labor. The invisible rhythm that kept ancient empires breathing. You can almost see them if you let your eyes relax. All those forgotten workers, still moving through the haze of time. A baker pulling his loaves from a stone oven. a shepherd staring out into the mist, a leech collector wading knee-deep in the marsh, a professional mourner, her voice cracking under the weight of someone else's grief. They didn't write laws, and they didn't carve their names into monuments, but they built everything that lasted long enough for anyone to write about. Empires were only possible because ordinary people woke up every morning and did something small, something dull, repetitive, but necessary. It's funny, isn't it? The things we call ancient wonders, the pyramids, the temples, the aqueducts, they were all built by hands that belonged to people whose names we'll never know. And those hands probably belonged to someone who complained about their boss, worried about dinner, and thought about going home early. Civilization, in all its grandeur, was just people trying to make it through their shift. Even the strangest jobs had meaning. The taster who risked his life for a king he didn't like, the herald who lost his voice shouting tax notices into an unamused crowd, the scribe who copied the same phrase 100 times a day until the ink blurred. None of them were heroes, but without them, the heroes would have had no one to feed them, heal them, or remember their names. And somewhere in all that, there's a strange kind of beauty, because these jobs, the mourners, the rat catchers, the perfume makers, they remind us that history isn't made of moments, it's made of maintenance. The quiet, unglamorous work that keeps everything from falling apart. Imagine ancient Babylon at dawn. The ziggurats glowing gold in the first light, the streets still wet from the night's cleaning, the scent of bread and oil drifting from an open window. People are already awake, someone's sharpening tools, someone's lighting a fire, someone's sweeping a courtyard that will be dirty again by noon, and in those small gestures, the world keeps turning. When we look back now, we tend to focus on the emperors and generals, the big names, the loud ones, but maybe it's the quiet people who actually deserve the bedtime stories, the ones whose work was so ordinary it became invisible. They didn't conquer. They didn't command. They just continued. That's what survival really is, continuing. You don't have to change the world. Just keep the lamps lit, keep the bread warm, keep the children fed and the floors swept. That's what every civilization ever built itself on. Maybe that's why these stories feel oddly comforting. Because when you strip away the marble, the crowns, and the divine titles, what you find underneath is something familiar. Ordinary people doing their best. People who got tired, who made mistakes, who complained about bad pay or terrible hours and still showed up again the next day. History isn't grand. It's sleepy. It's repetitive. It's human. So tonight, as the fires fade and the stars take their places over silent ruins, we can let them rest. The bakers, the scribes, the mourners, the torchbearers, the shepherds, and all the rest. Their work is done. Their stories have been told again, quietly, one more time. And tomorrow, someone else, somewhere, will rise before dawn to do something small, unnoticed, and entirely essential. And that's how it's always been. So, as you drift off, picture those ancient streets one last time. The flicker of lamps, the sound of sandals on stone, the distant hum of a market opening somewhere far away in the dark. All of it looping endlessly, soft and steady. The heartbeat of people who kept the world alive long before we arrived. Sleep well, traveler. History will still be here when you wake. Would you like me to suggest the next topic in this same sleepless historian style? Something just as strange and softly detailed. Maybe the forgotten food of lost civilizations, or royal sleep habits through the ages. All right, one last stretch then. We'll linger here a little longer, in that calm half, space between waking and sleep, where the world feels a bit weightless and the centuries all start to blur together. History softens here. The edges fade. Everyone from emperors to bakers just becomes a whisper in the same dark. Let's wander for a while through that quiet landscape. The fires have gone cold. The temples are just shadows now. But if we listen closely, we can still catch the faint hum of life, the tiny details that history forgot to erase. Out beyond the cities, someone's still awake, the watchmen. Every empire had them. They patrolled walls, stood guard at gates, or simply watched the stars to mark the hours. A good watchman wasn't measured by bravery, but by stillness. You had to be calm, quiet, unflinching. When the wind howled and torches sputtered, they were the ones who stayed put, the ones who didn't blink when everyone else was sleeping. In medieval Europe, they called the night rounds the curfew hour. Bells would ring, fires would be banked, and the watchman would walk the streets with lanterns and wooden rattles, warning people to keep indoors. Cover your fire. The word meant, that's what curfew literally is, a command to rest, to stop burning, to let the night breathe. Strange, isn't it? The same idea still lingers, even now, the world saying, enough for today. But of course, not everyone slept when told. There were others who thrived in the dark. The scribes who copied scrolls by lamplight, their ink-stained fingers tracing the same letters again and again. Each page took hours, sometimes days. A small mistake meant scraping the parchment and starting over. Yet they kept going, because preserving knowledge was the closest thing to eternity a person could reach. In a sense, they were the ancestors of every librarian, every writer, every night owl staring at a glowing screen now. Still awake, still copying the past into something new. Then there were the healers, the ones who carried herbs and strange mixtures through alleyways at midnight. Their world smelled like mint and smoke, vinegar and honey. They weren't scientists, not yet, but they understood balance, instinct, and the strange rhythm of the human body. Sometimes they cured, sometimes they made things worse. Either way, they tried, and trying in a world full of plagues and gods was an act of faith. Somewhere near them, those musicians were finishing their songs. In ancient courts, that was a profession too, not just entertainment, but a duty, to soothe kings, celebrate victories, or mourn the dead. The lyre, the harp, the flute, all soft sounds meant to touch what words couldn't reach. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the quiet strumming of strings echoing down marble corridors. It's the same impulse that drives lullabies today, the same hope that maybe, if we sing gently enough, the chaos will quiet for a moment. And when all else slept, there were the priests of the night Templars, men and women whose duty was to keep the sacred fires burning until dawn. Some stayed awake through the whole night, chanting softly, eyes half closed. Their gods didn't need grand gestures, just constancy. Flame, breath, silence. The ancient world revolved on rituals like that. Slow, steady, repetitive, like a heartbeat you could pray to. It's hard not to feel a little envy for that kind of certainty. Knowing exactly what to do with your hands at midnight, knowing that the world needed you to stay awake just a little longer. And so the cycle continued. Watchmen watching, healers healing, scribes writing, bakers kneading, shepherds counting stars, each one doing their part in a loop that never really stopped. It just changed costumes through time. When you zoom out far enough, the centuries stop mattering. A Roman lamplighter and a 19th century street sweeper and a modern truck driver are all the same story, told in different uniforms. People working, people waiting, people hoping for rest. Maybe that's why history feels so strangely familiar, because it's not really about the past at all. It's about repetition. Every generation rediscovers the same exhaustion, the same small joys. The first warm loaf of bread, the first sound of rain on a roof, the first time someone says, "You can sleep now. I'll keep watch." And maybe that's the true heartbeat of civilization. Not the palaces or the crowns, but that quiet promise that someone will stay awake so others can rest. The world's still humming softly somewhere, the same hum it's had since the first fires were lit in the dark. You don't need to understand it, you just need to listen. So, take a slow breath, let the noise of the past fade into the distance. The shepherds are asleep now, the scribes have closed their ink pots, the mourners' voices have gone quiet. There's nothing left to fix, no job left to do. History can handle itself for a few hours. For now, you've done your part. You've remembered them, and that's enough. Now, close your eyes. The night is still ancient, and it's waiting. Would you like me to begin the next 2-hour story in this same voice? Maybe royal sleep habits through the ages, or the secret lives of medieval servants. Both fit the same quiet, ironic rhythm. All right, we'll stay here a little longer, drifting through the last traces of the ancient dark. The fire's almost gone now, just the soft, orange pulse of coals that refuse to die. It feels right, somehow, to linger here with the ghosts of old work. They earned the company, because even when everyone else slept, someone always stayed awake. Someone always had to. Civilization doesn't pause, it just hums under its breath when no one's looking. Out by the city walls, the gatekeepers are still there. You can picture them wrapped in rough cloaks, leaning on spears, eyes half closed but alert enough to hear a footstep in the dust. Their job was both simple and impossible: decide who gets to enter the world and who stays outside it. A merchant, a pilgrim, a thief, all the same in the dark. The gatekeeper didn't need to know stories, just faces, a nod, a bribe, a look of trust or guilt. Entire fates turned on that quiet moment. Behind them, far from the gates, the potter's wheels are slowing down. Clay under calloused hands, spinning until it finds its form. Ancient pottery isn't glamorous, but it's eternal. Plates, lamps, urns, every fragment we dig up today was once part of someone's workday. A craftsman sweating in the sun, muttering about cracks in the kiln. That's the texture of history fingerprints baked into dirt, and nearby the scribes finish another scroll. They sigh, stretch their backs, and gently blow the ink dry. One more copy of a law no one will read, or a prayer someone will whisper once and forget. Still, it's done. The ink gleams faintly in the lamplight, and for a moment, the scribe looks proud. That moment matters. Even if no one remembers their name, they built a small bridge across time, a bridge made of words. Farther along in the narrow back streets, a midwife is knocking on a door. The cry of a woman in labor carries faintly through the night. She doesn't hesitate. She's done this 100 times. The air inside smells of sweat and herbs and fear. No one else in the room knows how this will end, but she does. Or at least, she knows what to do next. That kind of quiet knowledge has always been the world's most reliable magic. Outside, a night peddler passes, whispering his trade: dried figs, lamp oil, charms for good dreams. His voice blends with the wind. He's invisible, unimportant, but every household he visits will remember him in small ways. The oil that kept a lamp lit, the sweet taste that softened a long night. It's always the smallest gestures that keep people human. And high above, near the temple rooftops, a priest, astronomer, is still awake. The stars are his calendar, his gods, his only co-workers. He watches their slow movement and scratches notes onto clay. He doesn't know that someday someone will call this science. Right now, it's devotion, the patient kind, the kind that asks nothing back. It's strange, isn't it, how every ancient job seems to orbit the same truth, that everything, no matter how small, connects to something larger. The baker feeds the priest blesses the soldier guards the farmer feeds the baker again, a perfect, quiet loop of survival, repeating through millennia. And if you listen hard enough, the rhythm starts to sound like breathing, the world's breathing, yours too, maybe, slow, steady, familiar. Even now, nothing's really changed. We still fill the same roles, we just renamed them. The water carrier became the plumber. The torchbearer became the electrician. The herald turned into the newscaster. The scribe became, well, this, a quiet voice in the dark, trying to turn facts into something that feels like comfort. It's the same pattern, just softer now. Less clay, more pixels, less smoke, more hum. But if those old workers could look ahead, the bakers, the mourners, the gatekeepers, I think they'd understand us perfectly. They'd see the same wariness in our faces, the same small hopes. They'd know the feeling of staying up too late, doing something that won't be remembered, but still has to be done. That's the shared secret of every age. No one ever feels historic while they're working. They just feel tired. So maybe that's the gentlest lesson history has to offer. It's okay to be ordinary. It's okay to just do your part, however small it seems. The world keeps turning because of that. Because of you, and everyone like you, all the quiet workers whose names won't survive, but whose efforts always will. The fire's gone out now. The last sparks have turned to dust. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster's calling, which means morning has found us again. No matter how far we try to drift from it, the city will wake. The baker will light his oven. The gatekeeper will open the doors. The scribe will dip his pen in ink. The same day, over and over, until the centuries turn to whispers. That's the rhythm that never stops, the hum beneath all empires. So, for now, you can rest. Let the sound of the old world fade behind you. The footsteps, the fires, the laughter that never quite dies. History will keep working without you for a while. It's very good at that. You've listened long enough. You've kept watch. Now it's your turn to sleep. Good night.